He had never lost. In 2 years of war, Robert E. Lee had taken on armies twice his size, on ground not of his choosing, with troops who were sometimes barefoot, and he had beaten them anyway. Chancellorsville, Fredericksburg, Second Bull Run. Every time the Union thought it had him cornered, Lee found a move they hadn't seen coming. So when he marched his army north into Pennsylvania in the summer of 1863, the Confederacy had every reason to believe this was the move that ended the war. It wasn't. And the reason it wasn't has almost nothing to do with the battle everyone thinks lost it, and everything to do with a decision made weeks before a single shot was fired at a small Pennsylvania crossroads town called Gettysburg. In chess, there's a concept called playing blind. It's not a style, it's a catastrophe. It means your pieces don't know where the enemy is. Your king is exposed and you don't know it. The trap is already set. You just can't see it. Robert E. Lee walked into Gettysburg playing blind. And what made it worse, he didn't have to. This is not a story about Pickett's charge, though we'll get there. It's not simply a story about a general who attacked when he shouldn't have. It's a story about how the most dangerous blunders in history don't happen in a single moment. They compound. One poor decision enables the next. One missing piece leaves the board permanently unbalanced. By the time Lee realized what was happening, he was 3 moves deep into a position he couldn't escape. And the American Civil War, which the Confederacy had very real reasons to believe it could win, turned on those 3 moves. Let's set the board. By the summer of 1863, the war was not going the way most Northerners had expected. The Union had superior manpower, superior industry, a functioning navy, and the railroads. On paper, this should have been over. But Lee had turned the Eastern Theater into something approaching a stalemate. He'd bled the Army of the Potomac badly enough that Northern public opinion was fracturing. The peace movement was growing. There were real politicians, serious men, arguing that the war wasn't worth finishing. This was the Confederate endgame strategy, and it was not irrational. The South didn't need to conquer the North. It only needed to make the North quit. The question for Lee in mid-1863 was, how you deliver the blow that breaks Northern will entirely? His answer was to take the war north. Not just a raid, a full invasion of Pennsylvania. If Lee could win a decisive battle on Northern soil, force the Union to defend its own cities, the political consequences might be irreversible. Britain and France, watching from across the Atlantic and hungry for Southern cotton, might finally recognize the Confederacy. And if that happened, the war was effectively over. This was the game. This was why Gettysburg mattered long before the armies arrived. Lee's invasion of Pennsylvania wasn't reckless. It was a calculated gambit. Sacrifice the comfort of defensive Virginia ground to gain something worth far more: strategic initiative and political pressure on Washington. The problem was, a gambit only works if you know what your opponent is doing. In chess, you never advance your king into the center of the board without knowing where the enemy's pieces are. You need intelligence. You need to see the whole position. For Robert E. Lee, that intelligence came on 4 legs. Major General James Ewell Brown Stuart, JEB Stuart, was the finest cavalry commander in the Confederate Army and arguably in the war. He was Lee's eyes. His job wasn't just to fight. It was to tell Lee what was out there, where the Union Army was, how fast it was moving, what ground lay ahead. Without Stuart, Lee was riding north into enemy territory, functionally blind. And that is exactly what happened. On June 25, 1863, Stuart set out on what was supposed to be a rapid screening ride around the Union Army's eastern flank. He had done it before. Ridden entirely around the Army of the Potomac, returned with valuable intelligence, and come out looking like a legend. But this time, the Union Army moved faster than expected. Stuart couldn't cut back west, so he kept going east. then north, dragging a captured Union wagon train that slowed him to a crawl, chasing glory when his commander needed information. His 3 best cavalry brigades, gone. Lee's army marched north into Pennsylvania for over a week with almost no reliable reconnaissance. Stuart's absence during the early stages of the battle left Lee without cavalry reconnaissance and intelligence, depriving him of valuable information about the Union Army's strength, positions, and intentions. Lee's army was left blinded in enemy territory without detailed knowledge of the terrain, roads, or their opponent's strength and positions. Here is the first blunder, and it matters to understand who owns it. Popular history pins this entirely on Stuart's ego, and Stuart's ego absolutely played a role. His detractors claimed that Stuart's willful misinterpretation of Lee's orders caused his late arrival at Gettysburg and was a major cause of Lee's defeat, since the absence of cavalry permitted Lee to be surprised by the Union troops and forced into an early general engagement. But Lee was not simply a victim here. Lee had 7 brigades of cavalry, and Stuart took only 3. Lee had full use of the remaining 4 brigades, and is solely to blame if they were not used for scouting. 2 commanders, 2 failures of judgment, 1 army marching north without eyes. And here's what makes this truly consequential. Because Lee didn't know where Meade's army was when his forces stumbled into Union cavalry outside a small crossroads town on July 1st, Lee had no plan for it. The Battle of Gettysburg began by accident. The first mistake that was made by General Lee and his army was getting involved in a general engagement at Gettysburg, in spite of the fact that Lee had issued orders that he did not want his subordinate commanders to do so. Elements of A.P. Hill's corps were moving toward Gettysburg, looking for shoes. That's not a metaphor. The Confederate Army genuinely needed footwear. And they collided with Union cavalry under General John Buford, who had reached the town first. What happened next is one of the defining ironies of the war. The Confederates, in the fighting on July 1st, won. They pushed the Union forces back through town and onto the high ground south of Gettysburg, a long ridge called Cemetery Ridge, anchored at its southern end by 2 rocky hills called the Round Tops. From a short-term tactical view, the Confederates had done well. From a strategic view, they had walked into a trap they didn't yet recognize. General Winfield Hancock arrived to take command of the Union position on Cemetery Ridge that evening. He looked at the ground and immediately understood something that would haunt the Confederates for 2 more days. The ridge was a fishhook, defensible from nearly every angle, with commanding fields of fire across the open farmland below. The Union Army had been handed, by the chaos of an accidental battle, exactly the kind of ground you want to defend. And Lee? Lee now had to figure out what to do next on terrain he hadn't chosen, without cavalry to scout alternative routes, against an army whose full strength he still didn't know.
This is where the second great blunder enters the story, and this one is a choice. On the morning of July 2nd, Lee and his most experienced corps commander, Lieutenant General Longstreet, stood together on Seminary Ridge and looked east at the Union position. Longstreet was Lee's old warhorse. He had never lost a defensive position in the entire war, and what he saw on Cemetery Ridge alarmed him deeply. Longstreet advocated disengagement from the enemy after the first day's battle, embarking on a strategic flanking movement to place themselves on the Union line of communication and inviting a Union attack. In plain language, don't attack that ridge, move south. Interpose the Confederate Army between Meade and Washington. Force Meade to come off those heights and attack you. This is a classic positional chess principle. You don't smash your pieces against your opponent's strongest point. You reposition to a square that forces them to move. Longstreet's argument was sound. Militarily, historically, it holds up. Longstreet suggested a broad turning movement around the Union's left flank, believing this would entrench the Confederate Army in a way that would make it necessary for the Union to attack the Confederate position. Thus, the Confederates would be fighting a defensive battle. But Lee said no. He was taken aback when Lee responded fiercely, "If the enemy is there tomorrow, we must attack him." Why? Because Lee was operating under a dangerous combination of factors. First, he still lacked reliable intelligence on Meade's full strength. He thought the Union Army might be weaker than it was. Lee overestimated Union weakness and the disarray of the Army of the Potomac. Second, Lee had won so many times by being aggressive that aggression felt like the path to victory. His army had never lost a fight they'd initiated on their terms. Third, and perhaps most fatally, he was playing the political clock. A strategic retreat, even a tactical one, wouldn't make headlines in London and Paris as a Confederate victory. It might look like weakness. The whole reason he was in Pennsylvania was to break Northern will with a dramatic win. So, Lee chose to attack. And what happened on July 2nd told him, or should have told him, everything he needed to know about whether that decision was right. The fighting on July 2nd was savage and close. The Confederates came within yards of cracking the Union line at several points. At Little Round Top, a hill at the southern anchor of the Union position, a regiment of Alabama soldiers came within minutes of claiming the high ground that would have unraveled the entire Union defensive line. They didn't make it. While the Confederates had some initial successes, particularly in Devil's Den and the wheat field, they failed to achieve their primary objective of breaking through the Union line. The Union forces, despite being outnumbered and fighting a defensive battle, held their ground. By nightfall on July 2nd, Lee had attacked both flanks of the Union position. Both attacks had been repulsed. The Army of Northern Virginia had taken enormous casualties. The Army of the Potomac, battered, shaken, exhausted, was still on Cemetery Ridge. In chess, this is called losing the initiative. You've played aggressively, spent material, and the board has not changed in your favor. The opponent is still fortified, and you've made yourself weaker in the process. A wise player at this point steps back, reassesses, considers whether a different approach is possible. Longstreet that night pleaded with Lee to do exactly that. Longstreet wanted to pull back and dig into South Mountain to force the Yankees to attack from a great disadvantage. Lee said, once again, direct attack. Here is the part of this story that gets consistently misread. Longstreet is often portrayed, especially in the post-war Lost Cause mythology, as a slow, sulky, insubordinate general who cost Lee the battle. The truth is almost the opposite. Longstreet clashed with Lee about the tactics Lee was using, essentially telling Lee that his tactics were going to lead to defeat. And troops under Longstreet's command never lost a defensive position during the war. Longstreet wasn't a coward. He was the one reading the board correctly. But he was not in command. Lee was. And Lee, on the night of July 2nd, 1863, made the decision that sealed the endgame. Lee's plan for July 3rd was built on a single assumption, that Meade had weakened his center to reinforce his flanks. If that was true, a massive, concentrated assault straight at the middle of Cemetery Ridge might punch through. It was a reasonable inference from incomplete information. It was also wrong. At approximately 1 p.m. on July 3rd, 150 Confederate cannons opened fire in the largest artillery bombardment ever seen on American soil. The sound could reportedly be heard as far away as Pittsburgh. The bombardment lasted nearly an hour. The Confederate gunners were aiming for the Union artillery, the cannons that would shred infantry in the open, but they fired high. Most of the shells screamed over the heads of the Union soldiers and exploded harmlessly behind the ridge. The Union guns went quiet, deliberately, to save ammunition and convince the Confederates the bombardment had worked. It was a feint, a trap within a trap. And then 12,000 Confederates emerged and marched toward their target nearly 3/4 of a mile away across open ground. Longstreet thought the plan futile and only reluctantly agreed to it, telling Lee, "No 15,000 men who ever lived could take that position." He was right. In less than an hour, the assault crumbled. The Confederates retreated. Over half of the Confederate troops who began the assault became casualties, killed, wounded, or captured.
The Union suffered about 1,500 casualties, compared to approximately 6,500 Confederate casualties. A handful of Confederates, led by General Lewis Armstead, actually broke through the Union line momentarily at a spot that became known forever as the high watermark of the Confederacy. Armstead's hat on his sword point, urging his men forward. And then he fell, mortally wounded, and the breach closed around him. When Pickett was asked to consolidate his soldiers afterward, he reportedly replied, "I have no division." That stone wall on Cemetery Ridge was the last time the Confederacy had any realistic chance of winning the war on its own terms. Everything after July 3, 1863, every battle, every maneuver, every sacrifice, was the endgame. And endgames, when you're down this much material, almost never reverse. Lee retreated on July 4th, the 4th of July, an irony that was not lost on the Northern press. But even then, the story wasn't finished, because on that same day, July 4th, 1863, Vicksburg, Mississippi, fell to Ulysses S. Grant. The Confederacy had now lost control of the entire Mississippi River. The Western Confederacy was cut off. The strategy of squeezing Confederate supply lines from the West, a strategy Grant had been methodically executing for months, had succeeded. Two disasters, same week. The battle is often described as the war's turning point, due to the Union's decisive victory and its almost simultaneous concurrence with the victorious conclusion of the Siege of Vicksburg. This is what historians mean when they call Gettysburg a turning point. It wasn't just one lost battle, it was the simultaneous collapse of both Confederate strategic theaters at the same moment. Here's what most people don't fully grasp. The Confederacy did not lose the war because it ran out of brave soldiers. It never ran out of brave soldiers. It lost because it ran out of options. And Gettysburg was the moment the last realistic option, winning on Northern soil, forcing a political settlement, was permanently closed. After July 1863, the Confederacy was in pure endgame. No material advantage, no initiative, no diplomatic rescue coming. The only question was how long before the king fell. After the war, the survivors of the Confederacy faced a difficult reality. They had lost, not barely, not through bad luck alone. They had been defeated comprehensively. That's a hard story to live with, so they built a different one. The lost cause mythology, which hardened through the late 19th century, needed a villain for Gettysburg who wasn't Lee. Lee was too important to the myth's central thesis that the South had fought honorably against impossible odds, led by a near-perfect general. They chose Longstreet. He had been too slow on July 2nd, they said. His tardiness cost Lee the victory. His sulking after Lee rejected his counsel amounted to insubordination that doomed the assault. But look at the record. At Gettysburg, Longstreet told Lee that a direct assault would end in disaster, but Pickett's charge went forward anyway. The man who said, "Don't do this, it will fail," was blamed for the failure. It was one of the most successful reputation assassinations in American military history. It took historians over a century to fully rehabilitate Longstreet's record. The reason this matters beyond historical fairness is this. The lost cause mythology shaped how the South understood its defeat, and therefore how the peace was structured, how Reconstruction was resisted, and how the political identity of the post-war South was constructed. The story the Confederacy told about Gettysburg had consequences that stretched decades past the battle itself. History's blunders don't end at the battlefield. They keep moving. Let's go back one final time, because the most important question in this story is one that's rarely asked properly. Did Lee have to fight the way he fought at Gettysburg? Even without the scouting of Stuart's horsemen, Lee had attained a superb strategic position by his march into Pennsylvania. His army was well north of the Federal Army. Long before Meade could have reacted, Lee could have consolidated his army, crossed the Susquehanna, seized Harrisburg, broken the bridges, turned the river into a moat, and had a long head start down the uncontested road to Philadelphia.
the Union's second city, with 600,000 people, directly on the main North-South Railroad corridor and absolutely vital to the North. Read that again. Before the battle started, Lee was in a position where he might have taken Philadelphia without a major engagement. He could have forced Meade to come off the defensive and attack him on ground Lee chose at a time and place of Lee's choosing. If Lee moved on Philadelphia, Meade would have been obliged to stop him if he could. Anywhere along the way where there was a good defensive position with open flanks, Lee could have halted, drawn up his army, and waited. Meade would have been forced to attack. That was the game Longstreet was trying to play. That was the gambit Lee refused. Instead, Lee ordered a forced march on Gettysburg. It was like stepping off a cliff in the dark. He had no idea what lay ahead. The chess principle here is fundamental. You do not engage on your opponent's terms when you still hold the initiative. Lee held the initiative. He gave it away, first by letting Stuart go, then by fighting on ground he hadn't chosen, then by attacking a fortified position twice without breakthrough, then by sending 12,000 men across open fields into prepared artillery. Each decision flowed from the one before it. That's what a cascade of blunders looks like from the inside. No single dramatic mistake, a chain of compounding miscalculations, each one narrowing the options until there are no options. Here is what you should carry from this story. Gettysburg is not remembered correctly by most people. It's remembered as the place where brave men charged and fell, and a great general finally met his match, a symmetrical tragedy. Two armies, both magnificent, and one won. That framing misses everything important. The Confederacy arrived at Gettysburg holding a winning position, strategically, politically, and on the ground. The Union was scrambling. The Northern peace movement was at its peak. Britain was watching. What Lee needed, what the Confederacy needed, was not necessarily victory on Cemetery Ridge. It needed to avoid defeat. It needed to keep the pressure on without catastrophic loss. It needed to play the position. Instead, Lee forced the endgame before he was ready. He played for a knockout when he needed a slow positional squeeze. 3 blunders: losing his cavalry reconnaissance, refusing Longstreet's alternative, and ordering Pickett's charge, each one compounding the last. None of them individually certain to destroy the campaign. Together, they collapsed it entirely. And here is the lesson that extends past 1863, past the Civil War, past any single battle or general. The most dangerous mistake is not the one you make under pressure. It's the one you make when you think you're winning. Lee in Pennsylvania in 1863 was, on paper, in the strongest position the Confederacy had ever held. He was off Confederate soil, in enemy territory, with an army that believed it was invincible. That belief, that invincibility, is exactly what blinded him. The chess masters call it Zugzwang, the position where every move you make only makes things worse. Lee walked into Zugzwang not on July 3, 1863. He walked into it the moment he sent JEB Stuart riding east and let his army march north without eyes. By the time the guns opened on Cemetery Ridge, the board had already been decided. He just didn't know it yet. The high watermark of the Confederacy was not a place on a ridge in Pennsylvania. It was a moment, earlier, quieter, unremarkable, when a commander let his eyes go dark. And from that moment forward, the endgame only ran in one direction. What was the single most consequential mistake of the Civil War? Drop it in the comments.